Thank you for coming. This is our second week of our speaker series. Last week we had Doug Miller from, he was the executive director of Pennsbury Manor.
Okay.
And he spoke about William Penn, which I found fascinating. There were so many things I didn't know about. And so we are happy to continue with Dr. Stephen Nolt and from Elizabethtown College. And here's a little bit about him. He is the director of the Young Center for Anabaptist and
Pietist, yeah.
Thank you. At Elizabethtown College, a native of Lancaster County. He's been on the Elizabethtown faculty since 2016. He is the author of numerous books on Mennonite, Amish, and broader Pennsylvania German history and life, including Foreigners in Their Own Land, Pennsylvania Germans in the Early Republic, published by Penn State University Press. So my sister's here. If I say anything wrong, don't correct me. We have German in our background. Our family is from Bethlehem and Allentown, and my mother loved, all the German, the Amish sayings, and this one year she decided she was going to make the kitchen Pennsylvania Dutch. Now our kitchen wasn't very big. We had a small kitchen, but she put hex signs up and she painted, bright colors, red, blue, yellow. We had, you get too soon old and too late smart and out in the lights and all over the place. And I think there's a story that someone in our background was Amish.
Right.
Yeah, but I don't know that history. Al is going to look it up for me. He's our genealogist. Okay, enough of me. Let's get to Dr. Stephen Nolt. He's fascinating. We are so excited to have you here with us. So with that,
Well, thank you, Teresa, and all of you for being here this afternoon. I was just teaching until 12:30, so I closed things up and came over, and I'm happy to be with all of you today. I will try to speak loudly. If at some point you can't hear something that I'm saying, raise your hand or wave, and I'll try to talk louder. Usually I don't have trouble speaking loudly. The problem often is that I talk too fast. That's the complaint that I get from students. So I will try to slow down. I'm probably most associated nowadays, given my role at the Young Center, with studies having to do with the Amish. Amish were mentioned, and I enjoy my Amish studies, and that's been an important part of my professional life and also my personal life. I have Amish friends and so on. But my initial interest, and still my sort of ongoing interest under the media radar, is a broader Pennsylvania German history. So the book that was mentioned from Penn State Press, that started off initially as my graduate school work and dissertation. And so when I got to pick what I wanted to study, it was Pennsylvania German history. So this is, there's a lot of different directions we could go with this. So I picked out a few of the things that I thought maybe would be of interest. And so we'll go from there. And see how this. So a little bit about. So I'm going to talk about the origins. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges of Pennsylvania German identity, like who are the Pennsylvania Germans and who are they not, or who do people think they are, and then some examples of Pennsylvania German culture, which we could go down the line of food ways. That's not exactly my specialty, other than eating it. There are other people who are more. Understand that history a little more than I do. So I'm not going to say a lot about food, but I have some examples, including some examples of Pennsylvania German sense of themselves as Americans. So I think that was one of the themes that Teresa talked about with the America 250 theme. How are Pennsylvania Germans also part of American history? So that's one of the ways that where I hope we'll end up. So to start with, who are the Pennsylvania Germans? Where did they come from? The Pennsylvania Germans stem from a large wave of German-speaking migrants who came through the port of Philadelphia between 1683 and 1775. Most of them, actually the largest numbers, came between about 1750 and 1775, like the 25 years before the Revolution, is when the bulk, almost half of these people came in that 25-year period. So 1683 is the founding of Germantown, now a neighborhood in Philadelphia. Back in 1683, it was way out of town, not considered part of Philadelphia at all. And the initial folks who came in 1683, there were 13, well, it's often said there were 13 families, I guess, depending how you define a family. There were 11 families and 2 single men. And one of those families were Mennonites. Most of the families were radical pietists. Some were Lutherans. They were religiously mixed. And so it's a very small group in 1683, and German immigration then really picks up after about 1700, 1727, and then again, especially in the 25 years before the American Revolution. And they settle in what we call the Arc of Settlement. I'm going to have a map here in a moment. This Arc of Settlement, meaning if you think of like Allentown, Bethlehem, Easton, stretching down to Hagerstown, Maryland, that sort of arc in southeastern Pennsylvania, and then down into the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. So first, where did they come from? This might be a little hard to see depending where you're sitting, but this is a map of Central Europe. This is the North Sea. This is Denmark. Britain would be off the map right here. This is Switzerland. France is over here. This is the Adriatic Sea. So the areas here that show kind of shaded spots, those are the primary areas from which these German immigrants, that is, those of the 1700s coming to Philadelphia, are leaving. They're leaving from a variety of places. Some of them from Switzerland had moved north for a generation or two into the Palatinate. Others had long roots in the Palatinate, so this is the area from which they're coming. Later German immigration to the United States in the 1800s and the early 20th century is some coming from here, but the later German immigration is more from northern Germany. So this is the location, and then why do we know? So just jumping back here to these numbers. It's a very round number, so you might say, well, why don't we know more exactly? Well, one reason is because they didn't actually take down all the names. They certainly didn't take down all the names, and they didn't even take down all the numbers of people who were on ships at the time. They typically did not include children, and didn't always include people who were coming as contract labor, or we would say indentured labor. Sometimes they did. But we don't even have very good records at all until 1727, because in 1727, that's the first time that the English government says, okay, there are enough people coming from outside the English Empire, the British Empire, enough people coming from outside the empire, we need to have them all swear or affirm an oath of allegiance to the British crown. So that starts happening in 1727. They change the language a little bit in 1729. It's an oath of allegiance. And then 2 years later, they add abjuration, which means they added to the oath that you're not only pledging your allegiance to George II at this point, but you're also saying that you reject other people who have these spurious claims to the throne. So it's only in 1727 that we start getting the free male Germans, that they're actually keeping track of them for this reason. So I pulled this page out because the second name on this list from 1728 on the ship Morton House, this is my ancestor. It's Philip Nolt, settled south of here in the Hempfield area in 1728. Just thought I'd add that. So this is what we call the Arc of Settlement. I have the counties colored in yellow are counties that, it's a little hard to explain, but starting with the 1790 census, the counties in yellow are counties in which 25% or more of the residents had German surnames. Okay, so that's an imprecise way of doing this, but it's one way of kind of getting a bead on where people are. So again, you can see that Philadelphia itself and Chester County, there are some Germans, Pennsylvania Germans, in that area, in those areas, but those tended to be, Philadelphia was more mixed, and Chester County especially had large numbers of English Quakers. So these are the counties, a couple of them, we have, this is supposed to be, this isn't drawn actually all that well. This is Philadelphia County as opposed to the city of Philadelphia, which were just different at that time. But anyway, these are the counties. Lehigh County was still part of Northampton County at that time, and so on. And then you see going into Maryland and Shenandoah Valley and into the backcountry of North Carolina. So what we mean by the arc of settlement. The county that had the high, you can't see it from where you're seated, but in the 1790 census, 85% of the residents of Berks County had German surnames. So Berks County was really kind of the center. Lancaster County had 72%. So there are also a lot of Scots-Irish folks in Lancaster County and also English Quakers as well. And English who weren't Quakers, but yeah.
I was going to say Montgomery County, how much did they have?
That says 57%. Yeah. Northampton County, which again included Lehigh at the time, is 63%. Dauphin County, which at the time included Lebanon, is 52%. York County, which included Adams, was 49%. Those are some of the numbers. And again, they're a little bit fuzzy. This was somebody going through the 1790 census and trying to decide if it's a German surname or not. So, someone whose name was Zimmerman may have anglicized to Carpenter. I mean, there's different, it's a little hard, but it gives you an idea of the settlement. There's one kind of post Civil War addition to the Pennsylvania German population that we are only recently, I think it's fair to say, recently becoming familiar with, and that is the Hessian soldiers who were taken prisoner and housed in Lancaster, and then chose not to return to Europe. Okay, so there were tens of thousands of German soldiers who fought for the British. King George I, the great-grandfather of King George III, because there was a generation in there that died. So there's George I, George II, the next generation passed away, and then George III is the grandson of George II. They are from the House of Hanover. They come to England in 1714 from the continent. George I never did speak English till the day he died. And so they have these, they have lands in Germany. So the arrival of the Hessian soldiers is not surprising to people at the time. King George III was also the hereditary lord of Hanover in Germany. So these Hanoverian soldiers and Hessian soldiers come to fight. Lancaster was designated as the main POW holding area for British soldiers of all sorts, in a large area that's now what is First United Methodist Church in Lancaster, kind of on the corner of Walnut and Lime Streets. And there were other soldiers, other POWs that were held in York and some other places, but a lot of them in Lancaster, including Hessian soldiers. After the war was over, some of those German soldiers decided not to return to Europe. And then they stayed in the Lancaster area. And so this is an example of a piece of Fraktur by one of those Hessian soldiers named Christian Strenge, who ended up becoming a school teacher in Hempfield, before it was East and West Hempfield, in Hempfield Township, and what's later going to become East Petersburg, where some of his Fraktur is at the Winter Museum. So just last month, I was at a conference out in Columbus, Ohio, and there was a presenter talking about Hessian Fraktur, and that half of the Fraktur work that exists, that's documented, comes from Hessian soldiers, or after the war's over, not necessarily while they're soldiers. So he's doing work on, how we think of Fraktur as a traditional Pennsylvania German art form, and it is, but it disproportionately comes from these people who kind of blend in with the Pennsylvania German population after the Revolution. So that's just a piece that I don't know that much about yet, but it's something that's kind of we're learning more about. So again, this is back to that pale of settlement. And just to use an example of Pennsylvania German architecture and that Pale of Settlement. So I think many of you are probably familiar with the so-called Pennsylvania Barn, the Pennsylvania German Bank Barn. So Robert Ensminger did back in, this was a map from 2003. He was documenting concentrations of where that style of barn is found. And it follows Pennsylvania German settlement. It's most dominant in the Ark of Settlement and then in places through, mostly through the Midwest where people from southeastern Pennsylvania settled. So that you can, this map from 1790, there are all sorts of other kind of cultural things you can trace, including like barn architecture that very much follow that geography or places in which that shifts further west. And food, yeah. The Pennsylvania German identity was often connected to language. So Pennsylvania German or Pennsylvania Dutch, I'll say more in a moment about the term Pennsylvania Dutch, but this is a language that's sometimes referred to as a dialect. I have a friend, Mark Loudon, the author of this book, Pennsylvania Dutch, The Story of an American Language. He's a linguist in Wisconsin, at the University of Wisconsin, who studies, he studies Pennsylvania Dutch and Yiddish as variations of German. He insists on calling Pennsylvania German or Pennsylvania Dutch a language, not a dialect. And he also is clear that it is something that emerged in America. It is somewhat like the German that is spoken in the Palatinate today, but it's not exactly like. It's actually a combination of, remember that European map, the map of Europe with the different gray splotches. It has elements of all of those areas. So you can imagine you have people from all those places coming together, settling together, intermarrying, talking to each other, and within about a generation, they have developed a new German language that's a combination of these various dialects. So this is really an example of Pennsylvania German as a very American phenomenon. And then other things that we might, again, talk about architecture, foodways, artistic styles with Fraktur and other sorts of things. So, few things about Pennsylvania German identity. I said put identity crisis, as in, what does it through history? What has it meant to be Pennsylvania German, or what have been some of the points of confusion or frustration, or Pennsylvania Germans setting themselves against? That doesn't sound quite right, but defining themselves as not this, but this. So the first thing, I guess, to address is the question of Pennsylvania Dutch versus Pennsylvania German. And I probably shouldn't say versus or because it's because Pennsylvania German is Pennsylvania Dutch and vice versa. Now here's the piece that sometimes people are disappointed to hear, and I've had some people who actually refuse to believe me, so you don't have to believe me, but Pennsylvania Dutch, that does not stem from an English misunderstanding of the word Deutsch. It's not like Pennsylvania Germans arrived in Philadelphia and said, "Ich bin Deutsch," and the English couldn't understand that and said, "Oh, he must have said, I'm Dutch." And then they started calling them Dutch instead of Deutsch. As a number of people have documented through the years, so we have the Dutch windmill that I'm just using that as an example of what it's not. If you go back to the Oxford English Dictionary and look at how the term Dutch was used in English at the time, Dutch meant the Rhine River Valley. So when people arrived, having gone on a ship in Rotterdam from the Rhine River Valley, people in Philadelphia, English people in Philadelphia said, "Oh, here comes another shipload of Dutch people." Right? In the 1600s, 1700s, what we call Dutch or the Netherlands in English was referred to as the Low Dutch. But if you just said Dutch, you didn't mean people from the Netherlands. You meant people from the Rhine Valley. So anyway, Pennsylvania Dutch isn't a corruption of Deutsch. It is Pennsylvania Dutch is Pennsylvania German, kind of one and the same. So that's one, I guess, way in which Pennsylvania German identity can be confused. It can be associated with wooden shoes and windmills. Then there's the question of Pennsylvania Germans versus later arriving Germans, right? So Pennsylvania Germans, so we have the Pennsylvania Germans, augmented a bit by in Lancaster County by a handful of artistically influential, it turns out, Hessians who marry into Pennsylvania German circles. Then there's this major wave of German immigrants beginning in the 1830s, the 1840s, on up through the early 20th century. Numerically much larger than the Pennsylvania German population. Some of them settle in this part of Pennsylvania. Many of them are in New York, or they are in the Midwest. Some of them go to Texas. There's a whole phenomenon of Texas Germans. That's a whole area of study in itself. They go to Milwaukee, they go to Cincinnati, they go to Chicago, they go to the rural upper Midwest to Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota. And they are the folks that are associated with Oktoberfest and beer gardens and wearing lederhosen and things like that and dancing the polka. None of these things are associated with Pennsylvania Germans. I'm sorry to say. You can participate in these activities, please do, but these aren't Pennsylvania German activities. And you probably know that. But this is, again, part of one of the things for Pennsylvania Germans was you see this in some of the Pennsylvania German Society in the early 20th century. They sit around their meetings and say, well, what kind of cool activities can we do that people will enjoy? You know, the other Germans, they have all these fun things that people want to do. What can we do? So this is, I would say, identity crisis for the Pennsylvania Germans. We're Pennsylvania Germans, but we're not really Germans like many other Americans think Germans are, or could be, or should be. And just to throw in a local example here, Helen Ryman Snyder Martin was a novelist in the early 20th century, and she did a lot with her novels to present the idea that Pennsylvania Germans were not really true Germans. They really weren't good Germans. She was the daughter of German immigrants from Germany in the 19th century. Her parents moved to Ohio, and she later ended up in Lancaster. She was highly critical of Pennsylvania German culture. She said it was unsophisticated, it was rude and crude and not refined, and it wasn't really German. And she wrote a number of novels, including Tilly, the Mennonite Maid, and Sabina, A Story of the Amish, and a variety of others. I just chose those two covers because we have them in the library at the Young Center, but not all of her novels were about Amish or Mennonites. Most of her not, but her novels are about Pennsylvania Germans, and they all feature a dim-witted female protagonist, an overbearing Pennsylvania Dutch male character, and then the hero, who is either a true German, not Pennsylvania German, or an English American male. And the true German man or the English Anglo-American man then somehow rescues the Pennsylvania Dutch female character who is trapped in a benighted Pennsylvania German home. That's sort of the plot line for all of her novels. The Pennsylvania Dutch characters have names like Eliaphant Hinnerschitz and Ebenezer Duttenhofer and Ellie Seidensticker and Sam Shunk. I can't even pronounce them very well. The stories are all set up to kind of belittle Pennsylvania German culture.
They're written in English or German?
They're written in English. Yeah. And she was living in Lancaster at that time, Lancaster City. And she felt that she was a true German American, and she did not think that Pennsylvania German culture was really worth very much. So in one of the groups that responds to her, and they're not just responding to her, but the Pennsylvania German Society. This is a group that's still around today, but this was started by a group of fairly prominent Pennsylvania German business people and political figures who I have listed here. And they were not pleased with their representation in Martin's novels and in other representations of the Pennsylvania Germans. They felt like these are the people who are sitting around, as I said, saying, well, we should have some kind of image that is positive, like other German images. So they organized in 1891, and their emphasis was to focus on famous Pennsylvania Germans. Of course, when they started, they weren't including like Dwight Eisenhower because he wasn't famous yet. But this is the theme. They were trying to focus on Pennsylvania Germans who could be, who were famous and could be. And there's nothing wrong with this as an approach. I'm just saying this was the early approach of the Pennsylvania German Society, was to focus on famous, positive Pennsylvania German figures to kind of counter the idea that Pennsylvania Germans were rather dim-witted and uncultured and not very sophisticated. So these were the sort of people that they focused on. Another area, I see this, something shifted a little bit on the slide, but anyway, that says Mennonite and Amish. They were supposed to be in two columns. One of the other sources of a little bit of confusion, perhaps, in the larger Pennsylvania German, in terms of Pennsylvania German identity, is that especially in, the last 50 to 75 years, a lot of popular imagery and tourism has been focused on sectarian groups, like especially the Amish, but also Mennonites and Brethren. But for the bulk of Pennsylvania Germans in the 1700s and through to today would have, in religious terms, been members of Lutheran or Reformed churches, or in smaller numbers, the Moravians. These folks represented probably 80 to 85% of Pennsylvania Germans, and these people represented about 15%. And then there were about 5% of the Pennsylvania Germans who were Catholic. German Catholics are mostly part of that later migration in the 1800s and early 1900s. So a lot of Pennsylvania German history is mostly about Lutheran and Reformed churches. So here in Elizabethtown, Zion Lutheran Church, and then also Christ UCC, that was a German Reformed church, right? So you see that pattern throughout Lancaster and County and throughout this area, that there are a lot of Lutheran and Reformed churches. Those were numerically the most important of those churches. And in some places, these groups had shared meeting houses, and actually in some cases shared a pastor. This is a photo of Zion Church in Maxatawny, Pennsylvania, just beyond Kutztown. And you can't see it from here, but it says UCC/Lutheran. It's a union church. It hasn't merged in recent years because the two small churches merged. It's always been going back to the early 1800s. They had a single combined church, and there are a number of those in the Berks and Lehigh areas in particular that had these combined Lutheran and Reformed churches. This is a painting inside the Lutheran, a drawing from inside the Lutheran Church in York in 1800. We are one of our great visual sources for early Pennsylvania German culture was a man named Lewis Miller, who was a Pennsylvania German in York, and his original drawings are in the York History Center. And he has I included a couple of them here in my slides, but he documented Pennsylvania German life in York. So this is inside the church that's there. And he draws things, especially from the early 1800s. Well, he's drawing in the mid 1800s, but he's drawing things from his memory. Some of the things are dated. Like this is what I remember as a boy from the early 1800s. So as I said, although Lutheran and Reformed and to some degree Moravian are the majority, Pennsylvania Germans in the 20th century start getting associated especially with the Amish, which again is a frustration for the Pennsylvania Germans and for the Pennsylvania German Society. They finally Helen Martin stops writing her negative novels, and then about that time, the New York Times starts running stories like Amishmen battle to keep drab life, and this is a story about Pennsylvania's plain people. Yeah. The plain people of the Hex Country are making a last stand today against the devil. With bearded chins set like granite rocks and broad black hats planted firmly on their heads, they have gone to the law to save their children from the sin of pride and the worldliness of school. So to show this new image that isn't really accurate of most Pennsylvania Germans, that's kind of emerging. That's another sort of source of frustration for Pennsylvania German identity. And yet, if we even though the battle to keep drab life is we might laugh at that, and it's not really representative of all Pennsylvania German life. There is also something that we can see early on that other English Americans thought, not just for Amish or Mennonites or Brethren. This was in general among Pennsylvania Germans generally. There was a sense that they had that they were not ostentatious. They weren't necessarily plain in the way the Amish were, but they were seen as people who were simple in the sense of being not wasteful. They were thrifty, and they were not ostentatious. So this is a quote from a German Reformed source. Okay, so this is not an Amish or Mennonite source. This is German Reformed ministers in 1786, soon after the American Revolution, in Pennsylvania, and they're writing a letter back to Europe, and they are complaining about the English people around them. They said, the blessings of peace, so the American Revolution is just over, the blessing of peace has rather been attended with the sad consequences of display in dress, debauchery, and luxury. Now there are few, very few, who do not live above their stations. They're spending too much money. They're not being thrifty. Who do not live above their stations, so that a stranger on Sundays or festival days cannot possibly tell whom he meets. Right? So they're very concerned, not about their own flock, but that the English Americans have taken independence as license to just live however they want to live. Right? And this is not what Pennsylvania Germans are supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be a little more buttoned down than that. Not necessarily like the Amish with a drab life, but so this is also a long piece of Pennsylvania German tradition as well. And some of this, we might say, there's a legacy here of German sumptuary laws, which I won't go down that rabbit hole with that. You may not be familiar with this, but up until the French Revolution, that kind of swept away the last of these sumptuary laws, in the Rhine Valley, there were rules that specifically limited how you could dress based on what kind of person you were. If you were an artisan, or if you were a farmer, or if you were whatever. Like, you couldn't just dress however you wanted to. That really was an English, meaning England, idea. And it's one of the reasons the Quakers tried to limit their dress as a way of being different. But in England, but in the Rhine Valley, there were certain ways you had to dress. You could not dress above your station. If you were an ordinary person, you couldn't dress like someone who wasn't ordinary, right? And you could be fined if you dressed in other ways. So this is something that they bring with them, and something that those German Reformed ministers are dismayed about. Okay, and then last thing maybe is just to note that Pennsylvania German interaction with their neighbors also created things that their neighbors notice about them. So the non-ostentation is one of those. Another thing that their neighbors notice and start to say, oh, this must be a Pennsylvania German distinctive, is their approach to agriculture. So a lot of different examples we could give here, and this may be too small for you to read, but I'll read part of it. These are quotes from a diary in the Berks History Center in Reading, from the diary of a Welsh storekeeper named James Morris. And this is in 1845. He's writing about one of his Pennsylvania German neighbors, David Mast. September 12, 1845. This David Mast is one of the most enterprising men of our neighborhood, and as an agriculturalist, he has scarcely his equal. To a knowledge of the various theories, he adds an extensive practice and is not too timid to indulge in experiments. October 15th. David Mast proposes manuring the Watts farm, which is very poor, with bone dust. He has offered $5 per ton for all the bones that can be collected and wants 30 or more tons. This is the first attempt in this neighborhood to use bone manure. Now you can imagine the English residents are saying, who is paying good money for bones? Who wants bones, right? But he's trying to find a source for phosphorus and potassium. And he builds a bone mill. He pays people for animal bones, which seems crazy to his English neighbors. He grinds them up and applies them to his field. Sorry, I'm back here. June 10, this was October 1845. June 1846. David Mast, whom I mentioned last winter as having erected a bone mill, strewed or sowed a quantity of bone dust upon poor forest land on which he has sown some oats. A small patch of land was left unstrewn. See, there's his experience. He has a quality, he has a control, right? A small patch of land was left unstrewn, and the difference is remarkable. On the land on which the bone dust was applied, the oats is equal to any in the good valley land, while on the other, it is merely forest oats. So there's a lot of other examples one could give, but there's a sense in which there are positive values that other neighbors and other people start to attribute to Pennsylvania Germans, including skills in agriculture. One of the ones. I thought I'd shift now to some examples of contributions, cultural contributions beyond food of Pennsylvania Germans to wider American society. And one of those is in the realm of holidays and is in the realm of marking time. So a little bit of background here. In the context of the Reformation in the 1500s and in the 1600s, in England, there was a strong emphasis on stripping out most of the religious holidays as things that had been added to the church calendar by the Catholic Church. And so Presbyterians and Congregationalists, the people who settled New England and other British folks who came here to the Mid-Atlantic, they emphasized that we're not going to have religion, we're not going to have those Catholic religious holidays. We're only going to have Sunday. Sunday is the only religious holiday. They're very strong on Sunday being a separate day, but they didn't recognize Christmas, didn't recognize Good Friday. Easter was okay because it was a Sunday, not because it was Easter. And other holidays, they get rid of those. German Protestants never did that. The Lutheran and German Reformed and Moravians, they never got rid of those holidays. They didn't think that they were, Catholic holidays that needed to be purged from the calendar. So, and there were other religious traditions, religious days that Pennsylvania Germans from the Rhine Valley brought with them. One of those, or a couple of those, was the holiday of Candlemas, or February 2nd, which was not associated necessarily with a groundhog in the Rhine Valley, but was associated with a hedgehog. If the animal sees sun or clouds, the story here. This is something that they bring with them from the Rhine Valley. And again, that Robert Morris, the Welsh shopkeeper in Morgantown, in his diary, he refers to things like Christmas and Groundhog Day, or he calls it Candlemas. And he says, it's very strange, but these Pennsylvania Germans, they say they're Protestant, but they have all these Catholic holidays. He can't quite understand this as a Welshman, but these are holidays that they're bringing with them. Or July 2nd, which was known in Pennsylvania, an English translation in Pennsylvania Dutch it was Mary Went Over the Mountain Day. So this is the day marking when Mary goes to visit Elizabeth, to tell Elizabeth of her pregnancy, and this is it's sort of the 6-month similar sort of thing to Candlemas. If it's rainy or if it's clear, that suggests what the weather will be for the next 6 weeks. And so these were holidays that were brought to Pennsylvania, brought to North America by Pennsylvania Germans, and they've in some cases, particularly Mary Went Over the Mountains, has kind of died out. Although the other year I called an Amish friend, and he had you could leave a message on his voicemail, and this was sometime after July 2nd, and he's kind of a character, and he had this. It said, "Hello, you've reached Sam Stallsfru's. It was rainy when Mary went over the mountain, so we're having 6 weeks of rain. Leave a message, thank you." So he still remembered this day, but I think in some ways more, other days, Ascension Day, Pentecost Monday, Christmas, Second Christmas, again, all in contrast to Quaker and Presbyterian and Puritan ideas about how they had gotten rid of all of these holidays. And there was actually tension in the Pennsylvania legislature. In 1808, at the time, the legislature was paid actually this is still the case, but they're paid a per diem. They're only paid based on days they're in session, right? And so back in 1808, there was this question of whether the legislature met in December and January, and if you were really trying to save the state budget, you tried to have the session be as short as possible. And there were Pennsylvania Germans in the legislature, a number of Lutheran legislators who said, well, we're not coming into session on December 25 because it's Christmas. And the English majority of the legislature said, we have to work every single day, and Christmas is not a holiday. Religiously and otherwise, we don't believe in Christmas. And the Germans said, well, we do, and we're not coming. And to make matters worse, the Germans said, we're not coming the next day either because we believe in second Christmas. Because this was, again, a Rhine Valley tradition of December 25 and December 26. So they had a big argument over it, and eventually, there wasn't a quorum, so they didn't meet on December 25th or December 26th, and the English members of the legislature used this as an example that the Germans were not being thrifty and were running up the state budget because they were being paid for 2 days when they weren't in session. But this actually had, legal implications in some ways, these holidays. This is another artist, Louis Miller, again, the York artist, and he has this memory from 1809 of Pennsylvania Germans in York County putting up a Christmas tree. This is the earliest reference that we have to a Christmas tree. There are some references in Moravian sources that we think probably were a Christmas tree, is probably what's being referred to, but this is this early, again, you can't see it, but it says Christmas tree, and he's describing here one of his German neighbors in York and says that they had a Christmas tree. So this is a Pennsylvania German contribution to American culture is the Christmas tree. So this sentiment in the part of most English-rooted denominations, be they Presbyterian or later Methodist or others, of really not being too keen on these religious holidays. This continues well into the 19th century, right? So the International Sunday School Lesson Committee that's creating these ecumenical Sunday school lessons for children across America. It's dominated by these originally British rooted denominations, and they do not have any Sunday school references to Christmas or Easter or Pentecost or anything like that because they think that's Catholic, and they don't want that in their Protestant Sunday school curriculum. And it's John Starr, one of the German Reformed pastors from Lancaster, who gets elected or chosen to be part of the International Sunday School Committee in 1890. And he uses his position on the International Sunday School Lesson Committee after 1890 to convince them to start talking about Christmas and Easter and Pentecost in the Sunday school curriculum. And so it's only after 1890 that Protestant Sunday school curricula starts adopting these topics. Again, coming from this German Reformed, Pennsylvania German background. And at about the same time, there's another Pennsylvania German. He was on the earlier slide helping to start the Pennsylvania German Society. It's John Wanamaker, Pennsylvania German department store owner, and he starts also promoting Christmas trees and other kinds of decorations in his store in Philadelphia. So you kind of have this on the commercial level and on the Sunday school level, Pennsylvania Germans kind of changing American acceptance and receptivity to Christmas and other holidays. To kind of bring this to the America 250 and a little bit of a conclusion, what does it mean for Pennsylvania Germans to be American? You can't see this here, but this is, you probably can't read it from there. This is a Pennsylvania Dutch, in Pennsylvania Dutch brochure for Franklin Roosevelt. So this is an example of a political pamphlet from the 1940s. It says, The Democratic Side in Pennsylvania Dutch by Andy Jackson. What has the Republican done for the little guy? Andy's letter to the farmers. I want to remind you of something. Anyway, there are other examples as well, but this is something from this is Don Yoder, who I'll mention later. Don Yoder collected lots of Pennsylvania Dutch materials like this. These are now in the archives at University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. This is where their ideas about what does it mean to be American also drew on some of their religious sensibilities. So there's without going into all the explanation of pietism, a religious movement that influenced Lutheran and German Reformed folks, also influenced Brethren and other people, but especially influenced Lutheran and German Reformed folks in the Rhine Valley. They come to Pennsylvania, and this is an orientation that has theological implications, but it also has sort of social and political implications. It's an emphasis on a local orientation, not a lot of interest in kind of large, grand efforts to reform all of America or all of the world, but a focus on your family and your local community. And an example of where this sort of played out as an example of Americanization, really, is 1829, 1830. There's a debate in the United States about Sunday mail delivery. So this maybe needs a little bit of background if you're not familiar with it, but mail, delivery didn't mean that someone drove around in a truck and put mail in your mailbox at this time. Mail delivery meant that the post office was open for business. You had to go to the post office to get your mail and buy stamps and things like that. Stamps are actually coming a little bit later. But anyway, you had to go and the post office had to be open. So to say that mail was delivered 7 days a week meant that whoever the store owner was or wherever the mail was delivered had to be open 7 days a week so that people could come there and get their mail. So this, in the 1829 and 1830, there's a political movement, again, mostly on the part of Presbyterian and Methodist folks, people of more of English background, to try to try to end Sunday mail delivery, or to say that businesses that have a post office in them should be closed on Sunday. You have 6 days a week to get your mail. You don't need to get your mail on Sunday. So this is the anti-Sunday mail campaign. And the Pennsylvania German churches in this area, the churches and their members, the lay members, and down in Hagerstown, Maryland, they are staunchly opposed to this effort. And their neighbors can't understand. They say, but why are you opposed to? We think that you seem to observe Sunday as a day of rest. And the Pennsylvania Germans, say we would shrink from proposing a single objection to the extension of the Christian religion. In fact, the importance of Sunday as a day of worship and rest is too obvious to be questioned. We're not opposed to that, but we don't think that it's in our position to try to tell other people what to do with their time. And they explain this based on their history as they remember or think they remember it, coming from Germany, where they say we were oppressed. We came to Pennsylvania as a land of freedom, and we don't want to repeat the kind of religious oppression that we experienced in Europe. So they talk about their tradition, their distinctive German tradition, as being what's important about being American and what they think is the meaning of America, which is their understanding of liberty. So they're making this connection between Pennsylvania German identity and American identity. And I just have some quotes to read from the things that they were saying at the time. They observed, quote, with disaffection and alarm, the establishment of opulent and influential societies. So this is their non-ostentation. They also they're not too keen on the fact that the anti-Sunday mail group announced that they had gathered $14,000 in donations. They thought that just showed that something was wrong if they had that much money. And this was these anti-Sunday mail groups were they were becoming moralizing societies, enabling them to dictate to the conscience of their fellow men and assume the right to interfere in the direction of state affairs. Endeavors to procure legislative interference in matters of religion were attempts to infringe upon the rights of conscience, and in all measures adopted to compel particular observance of the Sabbath as an approach to the establishment of spiritual tyranny. We would shrink from proposing a single objection to the extension of the Christian religion, they affirmed, and yet when we review the histories of bygone ages, we find ourselves admonished by the wails of nations and groans of oppressed people, our ancestors, who faced the mixing of ecclesiastical and civil power. So in building their argument against this movement in 1829, 1830, they were drawing on their understanding of their Pennsylvania German history and saying that their approach was what was really important for them about being American, their understanding of American American liberty. They go on again to criticize in a kind of thrifty Pennsylvania German way that the arrogance of the Reform Association coal porters who wear imported broadclothes and strut about our country, asking for money for their purpose. In contrast to the activists' elaborate plans to employ large-scale political influence to reform society and systematically redeem the nation, the Lutheran and German Reform protesters presented a more local and modest proposal. Quote, "Our religious and moral duties are plainly set forth in the language of Scripture, and they consist in visiting the sick, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, and rendering due honor to parents, and exercising charity toward all men. Beyond that, we have no agenda." So that was their argument for what it meant to be American. That again, they were rooting in their own history as their history from Germany as they remembered it. And so one of the people later who articulates this is a man named Henry Harbaugh. He lived in Mercersburg, he lived in Lancaster, he lived in Lebanon. I'll say more about him, but he was a Pennsylvania German writer, and he wrote things for adults and also some children's periodicals, articles for children's periodicals, in which he talked about Pennsylvania German culture as being part of what made America great. So for him, Americanization was not assimilation. Americanization was being a good Pennsylvania German. So this was ethnic identity and American identity were two sides of the same coin, not in opposition to one another. And in the 20th century, there were a number of people, again, from this area. These were three men who at one point all taught at Franklin and Marshall. They then ended up going different ways, although Bill Fry remained at F&M teaching German, and Don Yoder went to the University of Pennsylvania to teach. But they were interested in Pennsylvania German life in terms of folk life and folk culture and language and studying language and custom and culture and folk life. And they started a movement that in 1967 was adopted by the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian patterned its first, what it called its Folklife Festival that was held on the Mall in 1967 on the Pennsylvania German Folk Festival in Kutztown. And they took this to Washington, D.C., and instead of being about Pennsylvania Germans, there were all different sections in the mall for all different kinds of ethnic and cultural groups. And after 1967, this morphed into the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, and that is the entity today that is institutionally, several layers back, responsible for the America 250 event. So in that sense, everything that you're doing this year ultimately, in some ways, is reliant on the work of people who were first interested in Pennsylvania Germans and making connections between Pennsylvania German identity and American identity. So stop with that. You can have comments or corrections or have more cookies and tea. So. Thank you.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, have you ever, I'm sure you visited the Berks County area a number of times, and I know my ancestors, they moved to the area. Do you know where Huff's Church is?
Yes, yeah.
Well, there's a road there called Conrad Road.
Okay.
That's where my ancestors moved, and they were they're about as Pennsylvania Dutch as
Yes.
it gets. Especially, I was really surprised to learn that, not really, that I think you said that Berks County was like 89% Pennsylvania Dutch.
Yes, in that 1790 census, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that day, and I was surprised about that. And I was also, you hear about the Pennsylvania Dutch, which they spoke, and I had wondered how it turned out to be that language. And as you mentioned, it was mostly when they arrived in the United States that these people from all over that area just merged their different and some American
Yeah.
words are in there then too.
Yeah.
Like, and mostly my parents spoke Pennsylvania Dutch, so that I would not understand what they were saying. That was pretty
Right.
that was pretty typical.
Yeah, at
you
a
know.
certain point, that becomes the
Yeah.
generational change. Yeah, yeah.
And then I thought the other interesting thing was the Dutch. I did not realize that was the Dutch area. The Rhine Valley was Dutch area.
Yeah.
So that was very
That was one of the points that Don Yoder, for example, always made, that he wanted to emphasize. But yeah, Berks County would have been, it's sort of geographically kind of it's sort of the center of that arc of settlement. And one of the other things that's that is distinctive is that there were not as, so coming sort of as you go further out of Philadelphia, there's also Quaker and other English settlement. And then if you move more to the Susquehanna Valley and further, there's more Scots-Irish settlement. So Berks County is kind of in that sweet spot of just a lot of German settlement. And then the part of Northampton County that became Lehigh County, the western part. So yeah, Lehigh and Berks County really are the kind of population centers percentage-wise. But I do think that, one of the things that happens in the course of the 20th century is for complex reasons, but as tourism becomes associated more and more just with the Amish, then there's this shift more to Lancaster. So in the mid-20th century, there's a fair bit of tourism to Lehigh County, northern Berks County, with Star Barn tours, or Hex Sign, if you want to call them that, Star Barn tours, and a lot of the food, the early food history is going north of Philadelphia into northern Montgomery County and Northampton and those areas for Pennsylvania German food. And then after like the 1950s, that kind of shifts to Lancaster and gets associated with Amish food. So in some ways, Berks and Lehigh counties get kind of left behind in that post-World War II tourism shift that focuses on Lancaster.
I wanted to say that my ancestors, I knew they came for religious freedom, and that I knew they were most likely Mennonite, but I didn't realize that they were actually Swiss Anabaptists. A couple years ago, I went on a tour.
Okay.
A Mennonite heritage tour. The Mast people.
Oh, right.
Related
Yeah.
here in Morgantown.
Right.
And it was like Brubaker family, but
Okay.
it kind of paralleled my Ellenberger family. And so I didn't realize that they were kicked out of Switzerland. And then they had to go to the Alsace region of France and then to their Palatinate. They had to register as Mennonites in Germany. And so, and then they made, after several, maybe 100 years or whatever, came to America. But that kind of helped me get a little perspective. When I visited like Bank Barnes in Switzerland, the gardens, it was pretty much what
Seemed very similar.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was very similar.
Yeah.
So that was kind of, put an extra chapter in.
Yeah, good. Yeah. And like, again, my friend Mark Loudon, who's studying language, he's able to identify in ways that I can't certain elements of Pennsylvania Dutch that are Swiss. It's mostly not Swiss, but there are a few little Swiss pieces that probably are, again, these especially Mennonites who have to leave Switzerland and end up in the Palatinate, and so they're also contributing their little Swiss piece to what becomes Pennsylvania Dutch.
Yes,
Yeah.
we met some Brubaker people from Germany. They said that that language of the Palatinate is pretty much similar to, I guess, the Pennsylvania Dutch YouTube
Yeah.
videos.
Yeah.
Was there much interaction between, I don't know what the native population in Lancaster was, in Reading, Conrad Weiser, and on the border there were lots of Native Americans, and
Right.
what kind of interactions and sharing of culture, but even
Right.
agricultural things,
Yeah.
technology.
That's a great question. The question is about interaction between Pennsylvania Germans and Native Americans. That's a great question. I am not a good person to answer that, I have to say. Just trying to think of what, if I can quickly come up with maybe a source to recommend. But there, I mean, there are some things like at the Conrad Weiser homestead. Of course, they talk about his involvement. There's, and this isn't really interaction, but it's kind of a. It was two Pennsylvania Germans, one with the last name I think of Brubaker, and one of Newcomer, who were the two people who went to Lancaster Borough and tipped off the borough government about the impending massacre of the Conestogas and said you should do something about this, which they didn't do anything. But there were two Pennsylvania Germans who said who tried to at least see if something could be done to prevent that from happening. Again, I'm not sure that's really answering your question, but like they sort of show up here and there in that story. But
And I know, I guess, the Moravians had an interest.
yeah, okay, that would be a good example. Right. So especially around Bethlehem and Nazareth and that area, right? There were definitely Lenape Moravians and who were writing some hymns in their own language that were set to Moravian tunes. And let's see, there was a speaker at the Young Center just a few years ago. Well, time flies. 3 years ago, maybe now. Who was talking about that? About Native American Moravian hymns that is part of Moravian hymnody.
The other thing is language acquisition. You didn't really need to learn English. I know Franklin was concerned about, for a lot of reasons, because of the competition.
Right.
The German press was competing with the
Right.
Anglo press, and there were
Yep.
probably more Germans, certainly German speakers,
Yeah.
than English at some point.
Yeah.
Well, certainly in certain areas.
Yeah, Franklin was very concerned about the competition from the Christopher Sowers, who were Pietist and Brethren printers in Germantown, who were horning in on Franklin's business.
Well, on his network.
Right.
More than just
Yeah.
Philadelphia. it's
Right.
a network.
Right.
And what else is it? Well, and the Moravians. I mean, yes, the Moravians weren't Anabaptists.
Right.
Was there like a lot of people? Were there lots of people sort of converting or intermarrying? And
I would say anecdotally, yes, just based on sort of my limited knowledge of genealogy. I can't quantify that for you, but I know that, I mean, my ancestry, to the degree that I can document things, is a mix of Mennonite and Lutheran and Reformed. I don't know that I have any Moravian ancestors, but this is my ancestry here in Lancaster County. Yeah, I think there was certainly a certain amount of that kind of intermarriage, and we see some of that in some of the early marriage records that have been nicely put together for Trinity Lutheran in Lancaster, and you can see connections between families that way through intermarriage. So. Yeah, certainly some of that. I can't quantify how common it was, but it certainly wasn't uncommon. Maybe others here who do more work in genealogy could speak more definitively to that. Yeah.
I was just wondering, being from the Bethlehem area, my mom and dad had lots of stories about the Moravians and the Putzes. Although we were Catholic, the Moravian influence was very strong in Bethlehem. And I happened to pick up a book one time when we were visiting about, it was from Moravian College, and they were talking about the history of the Moravians, and evidently they're Czechoslovakian originally, and they were persecuted against in Czechoslovakia. The Germans let them come and practice their religion, and then I guess this is the point where then they became associated or thought of as German.
Yeah, so they would have been in Moravia, which was a rather German speaking, mostly German speaking area of what was in Czechoslovakia, now sort of the border of Slovakia and Czech Republic. But yes, they move into then what is like the eastern part of Germany under the leadership of Nicholas Zinzendorf. And Zinzendorf, well, that's an interesting story in itself, but Zinzendorf is, and this is something that has only kind of become more integrated into Moravian, the way the Moravian history is told by Moravians in the last few generations. Not that it's a bad story, but it's just like his estate, Herrnhut, was in what was East Germany. So during the Cold War, it was really difficult to do a lot of the archives and things were hard to get to for Westerners. That's why I mean it's kind of a more recent, since 1990, there's been more work on Moravian history, so more things have come to light. But Zinzendorf was a Lutheran who had some pretty strong pietistic ideas, was a strong pietist Lutheran, and didn't always see eye to eye with other Lutherans. And he was, I don't want to say he was an opportunist, but he like connected with this Moravian group they were looking for a leader, and he was looking for a church that wasn't going to box him in quite as much as the Lutheran church structure did. So it was kind of a happy coincidence there. He was a wealthy nobleman, so he was able to provide this group from Moravia a safe place to live in what's now like Eastern Germany. And then later they come to Pennsylvania, especially the Bethlehem area, also somewhat Lidditz, and then also in Salem, North Carolina, and then spread out from those areas. Also in the British Caribbean in some places. And part of what then becomes part of the Moravian story, and this is a little bit, where it gets a little bit contrived, is that Zinzendorf wanted to basically have his church recognized in the British colonies. And there was a in the 1700s, there had been an act of parliament that recognized religious groups that had existed before the English Reformation, because they were trying to keep new groups out. And so he picked up on certain kernels of truth and put them together and said that this group in Moravia actually traced its origins back to Jan Hus before the Reformation. And that's a little bit true, but that's really a stretch. But he used that as an argument to say that we're not a new group, and therefore we can be more easily legally recognized. So that was a part of Moravian history as was told for a long time. In the last few years, looking at the Herrnhut records, it becomes clear that this was more of a political strategy for Zinzendorf to get status in the English colonies. There's a bit of historical connection there to Jan Hus, but not a lot. Yeah.
About 20 years ago, we had a friend from Germany who was an artist,
Mm-hmm.
and we drove out here one time. We were in Philadelphia. He loved the barns.
Uh-huh.
He drove around taking pictures of barns, and I didn't really, I said, yeah, they're fine. Well, I started looking at them and going, these are fabulous. I love them.
Uh-huh.
And so he had a great portfolio of barns.
Yeah.
I guess maybe where he was from, Aachen, is that where he's from?
Yeah.
Aachen, Germany. They had barns similar, and
Okay.
he just went crazy.
Yeah.
But when you mentioned the hex signs, when I was a kid, we went to the Kutztown Fair.
Uh-huh.
I was from New Jersey. And my mother decided to do a Pennsylvania Dutch kitchen. About the hex signs and the little sayings and all in the curtains, and she just went. And I grew up with that, like in the early 60s. That was very popular, but it was fun, and we went every year to the Kutztown Fair.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But the barns are beautiful. I love
Yeah.
them. So, that's from an artist.
Yeah.
Would you say Elizabethtown, it was settled by Scots-Irish,
Uh-huh.
but it seems like we have more of a German influence here in Elizabethtown.
Yeah.
What is your take on that?
Well, this part of Lancaster County, it is a kind of Mix, yeah. It's sort of a cultural borderland of both. I think, I'd say, and you sort of get that, again, going up into Dauphin County as well. But certainly there were. I mean, yes, there were also Germans, Pennsylvania Germans in this area as well. Yeah, in that sense, it's a little bit like the southern part of Lancaster County also had Scots-Irish settlement, but also a fair bit of English Quaker settlement in the south, southern Lancaster County, connecting in from southern Chester County, also.
The Germans really had quite an influence on a lot of different areas of life. For the holidays to, to food, as
Yeah.
you said, to
Right.
decorating kitchens.
Yeah.
To,
Yeah. Yeah.
Fascinating. I don't know if you know, but over next door, we have two cabins. One is Scots-Irish and the other is German. So, and Mary here is one of our docents.
Okay.
And she can explain the differences if you want to hear all the differences. But they talked about Mary Meyer Kaufman, and they said that she was a Mennonite, right? Was she at one time Mennonite?
Her religion never comes up.
Her religion never comes up. So, well, anyway, when they redid the cabins, they found pottery that was, rather fancy. Where if you were Mennonite, you weren't supposed to, right? Have.
Well, so that's an interesting question. I actually think earlier. I mean, I think it would depend how old it is, but some of us think that particularly in the first half of the 19th century, there were just a lot more similarities. First of all, you had the Lutheran and German Reform folks who, the anti-ostentation sort of sentiment, or that picture of Henry Harbaugh. He was not, I mean, people see that picture and say, oh, he must have been an Amish man. He didn't have a mustache, he had the plain coat, but he was not. He was Reformed. And so I think there's sort of like this strong aesthetic of non-ostentation on the so-called church groups. And I think many of the more sectarian groups were not as severely plain as they became later. So by the time you get to things like the Kutztown Folk Festival in the 1950s, these groups seem to be quite starkly different. But I don't think we can read, I don't think we should necessarily read that back into time 100 years earlier. So I guess I would say if finding things like that in the cabin wouldn't necessarily tell you, it would tell you more if it was an item from like 1950 than from 1850.
Well, what was interesting was someone gave a talk, and then they said that what happened was they found her tombstone over in the Catholic Church.
Okay.
So they believe at one point, she converted to Catholicism, and therefore she was able to have fancy things.
Okay.
I don't.
Yeah.
It's interesting the history.
Yeah.
And what you read.
Yeah.
I have one silly question.
Yeah.
You mentioned Wanamaker.
Yeah.
And who was Schoenmaker? Am I saying it right? He was the toy maker. He came over from Germany. We have his little pianos, the wooden pianos. And he went on to be the biggest toy maker in the United States at that time. I believe it was at the turn of the century. And
I don't know. I associate so when you say toys, I associate the early German, Lutheran, Pennsylvania German family in Lancaster was the Hubley family. In fact, and then Hubley Toy Company was, and that's like Bernard Hubley was like the first trustee of Trinity Lutheran Church in Lancaster, and the Hubleys are around during the American Revolution. There's a Hubley who is one of the militia colonels for Lancaster, I believe, and then they develop a toy company. But I can't say more than that.
Okay.
So I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying I
Right,
can't. Add more to that. Yeah.
Because I didn't know if he had anything to do with the organ in Wanamaker's too,
okay,
because
okay,
he did
yeah.
toy pianos.
Right. Could be. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much. That
Sure.
was very interesting. I could
Sure.
ask you a million questions.
joining us on this wonderful, nice afternoon. Next week, we have Ambassador John Craig coming, and he's a fascinating speaker. And the following week, Nancy Landis will be coming, and she might even bring a sheep. And we'll be doing from sheep to shear. I'm saying it wrong. From sheep to shawl. And we have a lot more other speakers coming, and we're thrilled to death that you join us each week. Trellis provided the little scones. She thought our program was going to be this evening, so they were going to provide us with more, but when I called her up and said we're coming to pick it up, she's like, what? So if you join us next week, you'll have more than just scones, if that's a plug to